Greetings, Internet! It feels like it's been forever since I made any major videos on my channel, but I figured that since one of my big points of interest with my more recent videos were a series I did called Underappreciated Characters, I decided to go with that for this big entry. Now, Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a movie that I've talked about a number of times on this channel. I did nearly 5 years ago when the announcement that it was getting a live-action remake was announced, and I gave my reasons defending how I saw that could work, although that no longer seems to be happening with an unverified source saying that the remake was reportedly cancelled. I mentioned the movie again a few months later after that announcement when I made a video in light of the fire that broke out in Notre Dame Cathedral, and I dedicated a half-hour video essay to discussing why the direct-to-video sequel was one of the worst movies I have ever seen. I know that I'm not the only one who loves the movie. However, when I hear people talk about how The Hunchback of Notre Dame is an underrated masterpiece, the arguments easily, like almost 90% of the time, default to its dark tone, Frollo being one of the best villains Disney ever conjured up, and of course, Hellfire. All of which I fully dedicate my praise to as well. However, those parts of the film tend to get saturated with the most praise and indulgence from people who get so caught up in the fight to prove how the film is the most adult in Disney's film catalog, to the point where I have legit heard people say that Hellfire is the only good song in the score, and that the rest of the cast besides Frollo is boring as tar. All of that talk, I think, does the movie overall more of a disservice rather than raising it up on a pedestal. And I think it also displays some rather narrow points of view from people who are so caught up in bucking the animation is for kids mindset rather than how the story or characters resonate with them personally. Not that fighting to prove that animation is a medium for all ages is a bad thing. I mean, last year I've had plenty of instances proving that it still does need fighting, but doing it tactlessly does pave the way for a lot of elitist mindsets. And honestly, it kind of renders a story void of its purpose to connect with people personally when people are so focused on seeing how it can subvert expectations or buck old cliches and stereotypes. Anyways, even in other cases, when people do heap praise onto the rest of the movie, more or less, when they love and connect with the other characters, Quasimodo, Esmeralda, and even Clopan the narrator slash puppet master among fangirls, as even the gargoyles, which I have seen a few examples of people who love them as sidekicks, there is one character in the movie whom I've seen be frequently met by many audience members for several years after the film was first released with either dismissiveness or flat-out disdain. And no, it's not any of the gargoyles, surprisingly. It's the captain of the Cathedral Guard, Phoebus, or Phoebus de Martin as he's named in other sources. Another controversial part of the movie that didn't relate to the non-child-friendly elements was the whole love dynamic between Esmeralda and the three men. I've seen Phoebus often branded as the generic white hero guy, or an unnecessary fourth addition to the love triangle, or being the handsome guy who stole Quasi's girl, emphasizing the moral that non-attractive people are always doomed to come in behind. None of which I ever thought the character deserved, but I think the ultimate indignity for him came with his portrayal in the sequel, which I already went into great detail about when I discussed that movie. Not even Kevin Kline reprising his role in the sequel could save it, which was all the more depressing, as Kevin Kline is an actor whom I'll pretty much watch in just about anything he's in. Fortunately, I have seen audiences warm up to Disney's Phoebus over the years, especially from men who got to play him in various productions of the stage musical adaptation, even getting occasional appearances in Disney parks all over along with the other characters. Since I still have a few points to address myself, I'm here to give some defense to Phoebus as a character and why I think he's an unsung hero. In the Disney movie, I mean. In case you weren't already aware, he's a terrible character in the book. Though I will be briefly addressing his portrayals in other screen adaptations of the story, as well as another character from the book who is romantically involved with Esmeralda, and his portrayal in both Disney stage musicals. Yes, I will be mentioning both the more modern English version and the earlier German production that ran from 1999 to 2002. Now, Disney's Phoebus is one character who didn't exactly have an arc in the film, but I argue that he didn't need one to work well as a supporting character. There are lots of stories which are served well by supporting characters, and even in some very special cases, main characters, who went through their entire stories without an arc, or one that wasn't so overt. Phoebus is a character who has already matured from his experience, according to the filmmakers. Having survived in the war, he's done his growing up, he knows what the world can be like, and he has developed a strong moral compass, along with a great sense of humor to help him cope with tough situations and or tough people he has to work for, like Frollo. And with his maturity, Phoebus exemplifies himself as being just as capable of genuine selfless love for Esmeralda as Quasimodo is. And yes, I stand firmly by that. In fact, he is very much integral to the love dynamic with Esmeralda, especially since his romantic relationship with her is the most healthy out of all three of them. There's this YouTube channel called Wicked Binge, which I kind of regard as akin to the likes of Watch Mojo or Film Theorizer. One of those 1,000/million plus subscriber channels that's there to mass produce content daily rather than analyze or have, say, meaningful discussions about it. But I do think that they can still bring up good points and are generally well informed when they make their lists. In Wicked Binge's video on the Hunchback characters Good to Evil, Phoebus took second place on the list, right behind the Archdeacon. Yes, even on a list that featured the Gargoyles, the animal sidekicks Jolly and Achilles, and even all the characters from the sequel. I don't disagree with their reasons for it, even if other people can't or simply refuse to see those reasons. For starters, they make a point that Phoebus is the least prejudiced character in the story, next to the Archdeacon, and I agree that is accurate. Frollo hardly needs an introduction on his worldviews, but Quasimodo is also a victim to this due to his upbringing from Frollo. And even Esmeralda arguably has some level of prejudice, particularly when it comes to soldiers, just as other Romani naturally would. Understandable and even justifiable preconceptions, of course, but she still has an arc where she learns to take another look at Phoebus and change said preconceptions about him. In fact, the most prejudiced thing Phoebus does in the entire movie is minor stereotyping when he says, "I was summoned from the wars to capture fortune tellers and palm readers." But even that sentence is outweighed by the fact that it illustrates how he doesn't see them as any inherent threat just by virtue of their lifestyle or their race. It's not like he doesn't recognize that thievery is an issue or anything, but it's not something that he automatically attributes to race or their background. As he did just see Esmeralda making her fair earnings dancing for coins on the street, even giving her one himself, and was even returning to her a few that she dropped. He even requested permission from Frollo to stop Quasimodo's public torment, which started being stirred by the other soldiers, mind you, right before Esmeralda stepped in. And as it turns out, Phoebus is the most mutual with Esmeralda of all the three men in the movie who have eyes for her. Frollo looks down on her as a product of the devil come to draw him in down the path of sin. Quasimodo looks up to her as this perfect angel come to be the one source of light in his life. But Phoebus is the one who, right from the get-go, sees eye to eye with her as simply human. Neither of them necessarily seek any romantic interest in the beginning, it's just something that happens naturally to them over the course of the story. The channel Dig Dag Studios made a video a couple years back dissecting the three romances, describing them as love, lust, and infatuation. And I think he very well summed up most of the points I plan to bring up here, but I still have some of my own points that I wish to make. But to start off with describing the roles that Frollo and Quasimodo play in the love story, Frollo lusts over Esmeralda, even having lust confused for genuine love. He is sympathetic to the extent that he was raised in a dogmatic environment where such feelings related to attraction are deemed sinful, and it's a system that has warped his mind to make all these natural human feelings feel so unnatural to him that he is afraid of them. But the big thing that makes him a villainous figure is how he is so afraid to confront anything potentially impure about himself that he projects these feelings onto others, blaming Esmeralda or anyone but himself for his feelings and his actions, and that only elevates his narcissism, another trait which he has but refuses to confront. He thinks that temptation is such a base human urge that he's risen above, but when he does feel tempted, he's grown to believe that he's entitled to take it, and justify it by claiming that he's the source of Esmeralda's salvation. That's his definition of love. It's one of a mind that has been warped by a flawed system, but one that is false and is ultimately existent just to serve himself first and foremost. Quasimodo, on the other hand, has puppy love for Esmeralda, which is at least some form of infatuation, which grows into real mature love over the course of the story. Since he's been gaslighted his whole life to believe that he's this unlovable monster whom only a man as pure and righteous as Frollo could ever love, when Esmeralda is the first person to show him any kind of unconditional kindness, it's such a glorious feeling that he instantly attributes to love in the romantic sense, seeing Esmeralda as sort of this gift from heaven to him, hence what the song Heaven's Light is all about. And because of this, he develops endless devotion to her and willingness to do anything for her, which sets him up for the ultimate heartbreak when he finds out that she's in love with Phoebus, even decides to give up on saving her at one point, believing that he's not her hero and there's no point in him trying to be. Understandable as it may be for him to be left feeling this way after being put through the ringer his whole life, it's still a mindset that ultimately does come from a sense of love that benefits himself, not unlike Frollo's, even if it is to a far less dangerous extreme. Because loving someone doesn't mean that you should be dependent on them. As Olaf says, it's about putting their needs before yours. It's really at the point in the movie where Quasimodo is able to put aside his personal feelings and go out of his way to save Esmeralda, both during the climax and also during that moment when he ventures out alongside Phoebus to fight the Court of Miracles, without expecting any personal reward for it, that he shows that he genuinely loves and respects Esmeralda. He's not just in love with his dream of her being there to fulfill his life. Phoebus, however, does not and never has seen Esmeralda as a prize to claim or someone who exists to serve him first and foremost. Him being impressed when he first spots her dancing in the street was a spark between them, but the whole time he knows her, he respects her boundaries, never seeking any personal gain from getting to know her. He doesn't need her to determine for him what sacrifices he's willing to make or for what cause. That's what made Esmeralda fall in love with him in the first place. It's that moment where he not only refuses to burn down the miller's family, but also breaks them out from the burning mill. I feel that's the moment where Esmeralda truly sees him for who he is. He isn't someone who is merely going to step inside and refuse to carry out Frollo's orders and throw away his career and prospects for it. He's actively taking a stand by saving the family Frollo had condemned to death, not to win the heart of any pretty girls, but because he values other people's lives even at the expense of his own. That's when Esmeralda sees that he shares her passion for justice, that he expresses the same selfless sentiments that she expressed in God Help the Outcasts. He is inquisitive and open to what Esmeralda is like as a person, and in all of his interactions with her, he leaves the ball completely in her court regarding what she thinks of him, which is really the best way you can be on the good side of anyone whom you find attraction to, not by using charm, talent, or good looks to woo them. I mean, for Quasimodo to think that Esmeralda only likes Phoebus because he's handsome is understandable, as Quasimodo has spent his entire life in seclusion, brought up to believe that he's unlovable just because of his deformity, so literally anyone has the upper hand on him in that regard. But that's the very thing in the story that he has to unlearn. And really, to imply that sort of thing about Esmeralda is really kind of an insult to her character as well. For Disney's Esmeralda, with the ways that she's established herself throughout the story, not only does that imply that she's not very intelligent, but it's also rather counterintuitive to the wits and street savviness she has developed from her life of growing up in the streets. Since she makes a living dancing and wowing men with her physical beauty, she would be only too aware of how other men would try to take advantage of her and objectify her just the same way Frollo does. Her life experiences would help her to recognizing which men would only have surface-level interest in her. If Phoebus were like how he is in the book, she would pull no punches and would go as hard as she does during her first scuffle with him in the cathedral, most likely even harder. Now, I know that there's been this whole chain of real-world social political events going on this past decade that have given a bit of a bad rap to the idea of portraying policemen/authority figures, possibly even fictional ones, in a positive, heroic light. I get that. And to add to that, there's also the whole discussion of the white savior, or some kind of savior mentality when it comes to trying to extend a hand to more marginalized groups. However, as I've heard some say, there is a distinct difference between a savior complex versus being an ally. An ally is someone who stands behind or alongside those fighting for themselves. A savior is someone who wants to stand at the front to get all the recognition for it. The one character in the story who does have a savior complex is Frollo, having the status as a religious judge whom the people look to for salvation, but ultimately uses that status to serve himself under the guise even he's brought into that it's all in God's will. And Quasimodo could easily have developed this sort of complex too if he was only in for saving Esmeralda for the sake of getting romance points, or even just to be seen as her guardian angel. Phoebus, however, bucks anything related to any savior archetype for one very specific reason. By helping the outcasts, he becomes an outcast himself. He has pretty much always had his heart in the right place from the beginning, even when he was a soldier, where he could do little things here and there to help others. But it's when he renounces his place in Frollo's guard and takes an active stand against Frollo, sacrificing his career and prospects and being left behind with practically nothing, that's when he becomes an ally to Esmeralda and her people, just as much as Esmeralda is an ally to Quasimodo. Heck, Phoebus even establishes himself as an ally to Quasimodo as well, albeit a secondary one. Let's not forget that he's the one to save Quasi from falling to his death at the end of the film, and from the beginning, even when it's Esmeralda rather than him who stops Quasi's public torment, he compliments Quasi about how lucky Esmeralda is to have a friend like him. And Phoebus isn't oblivious to the heartbreak Quasi was feeling either. I mean, when Esmeralda was giving him thanks for risking his life to get to the Court of Miracles to warn her, Phoebus ultimately gives all the credit to Quasi for getting them there. Now, I did mention earlier that I was going to bring up Phoebus in other adaptations of the story, so just to get that out of the way, the basic synopsis for how he is in the book, for those of you not already aware, he's more akin to Gaston than any other Disney character, a handsome, self-serving, womanizing cad devoid of any sense of morality imaginable. He briefly saves Esmeralda from Quasimodo when Frollo orders him to kidnap her for him, and she immediately falls head over heels for the soldier, getting whisked away in her own fantasy of him being her savior, when he is in fact engaged to marry another woman at that very time. Then, when Frollo gets jealous, he stabs Phoebus and frames Esmeralda for it so he can try to blackmail her into giving herself up to him. And as she's led to her execution, Phoebus just watches from the sidelines with absolutely no empathy or remorse for her, or any remorse for anything he's done on his behalf of betraying the woman he's engaged to. Arguably, he could be seen as kind of a parallel character to Frollo, far less dynamic, but arguably just as bad, as both are of the same sense of entitlement to having their way with Esmeralda for their own benefit. The only difference is that Phoebus doesn't try to pretend or try to convince himself or anyone else otherwise that it's for anyone's interest but himself. Frollo's primary vice is his piety. Phoebus is simply vanity. The way Phoebus is depicted in other film adaptations of Hunchback varies, though he doesn't generally have much in the way of dimension in any of them, or in the case of the 1997 made-for-TV movie, the most recent major screen adaptation of the story, he's been removed altogether. In the 1925 silent film, he is portrayed as a classic dashing Hollywood hero who is predestined by early Hollywood movie standards to be the one to get the girl, far less of a cad than in the book. In the 1939 spiritual remake of the film, the 1959 French film, and the 1982 made-for-TV movie all portray him exactly like his book counterpart, except that in the 1939 film, Frollo stabs him and he remains dead and out of the rest of the picture. Thankfully. And all of those adaptations of the story have Esmeralda wising up after his murder, or supposed murder, recognizing which other men truly love her and value her as a person, and especially with her being much nicer to Quasimodo than she is in the book. But even if you've heard about that detail in the novel, what you may not know is that Disney's Phoebus is a composite of the soldier and another character in the book called Pierre Gringoire, a romantic poet/advocate for justice who is the one to rile up the citizens of Paris to defend Notre Dame during the siege, and is introduced as a commoner of humble origins, sympathetic to the plight of the less fortunate, while also being mesmerized by Esmeralda. And it is he who gets subjected to what we see in Disney's Court of Miracles musical sequence. He stumbles upon the Romani's secret hiding place and is said to be hanged, except in the book and other adaptations. They agree to spare him if one of the Romani women takes him for a husband, and who else to do that but Esmeralda? The Disney movie did at one point contain this wedding scene, set to a now-deleted song called As Long as There's a Moon, and Quasimodo was supposed to join Esmeralda's hand with Phoebus's before he could really come to terms with and accept not being her choice for a romantic partner. And this was supposed to be a mirror at the end of the film when he officially joins their hands and has made peace with his heartbreak. Although the song was rightfully removed from the film so it didn't obstruct the flow of the story in a moment where the stakes were far too great, the song itself is a pleasant listen, and I'll provide a link to it. Gringoire also has different relationships with Esmeralda in various adaptations of the story. In the 1925 silent film, Gringoire and Phoebus both work as a team to help save Esmeralda at the climax, while Esmeralda is still in Quasimodo's care in Notre Dame Sanctuary. He's treated as kind of a third wheel in that sense, but he doesn't make a big stink of it. In the 1939 movie, he's initially angry and hurt when he discovers that she only married him out of pity, but softens immediately after saying, "I'm ready to live with you as husband and wife if you think good, or as brother and sister if you think better." Though that does develop into more of a husband and wife love over the film. In the 1956 French film, it plays more or less like in the book, where she saves him and then says, "Out of my room," while he's still wistfully dedicating songs and poetry to her. In the 1982 made-for-TV movie, while he doesn't hold a grudge against Esmeralda's lack of reciprocation for his feelings towards her, he does try to warn her that Phoebus isn't the man she thinks he is, and later she does wise up and accepts Gringoire as her true husband. And in 1997, it's only Gringoire who says, like he does in the 1939 film, that he's happy to live with her as husband and wife or as brother and sister. But the one thing that he has in common with all of these adaptations is that he, like Disney's Phoebus, loves and respects Esmeralda as her own person, and is not just in it for himself. Now on to discussing Phoebus's portrayal in both Disney stage adaptations of Hunchback, both the current one and the earlier German one from the late 90s, early 2000s. In both, Phoebus has an arc where he starts out something similar to his book counterpart, a gallivanting womanizer looking for a simple life of rest and recreation away from the horrors of the battlefield, just doing the job he was called to do, abiding by the mindset that a soldier knows not to fight a battle he can't win, while also being interested in Esmeralda as a person, but then becomes more or less like his animated film version where he sympathizes with the plight she shares with her people and retaliates against Frollo and becomes an outcast in the process. Granted, when it comes to him refusing to carry out the order to burn down a house, I do think it has less impact when it removes him breaking out the family inside. I know that it would be a hard thing to stage as opposed to simply extinguishing a torch, but I do believe that him saving people directly in danger does speak more volumes about his character and what Esmeralda would see in him. But also in both, a critical moment where Phoebus has his moment to show genuine, selfless love for Esmeralda, even after making it to the Court of Miracles, comes during a scene where both he and Esmeralda are imprisoned in the Bastille, where their duet song Someday takes place. Frollo tries to use Phoebus as leverage to coerce Esmeralda to give herself up to him, and Phoebus tells her, "Don't do it to save me, do it to save yourself." Of course, she admits that she could never bring herself to do such a thing, except to save someone else. But let's face it, if someone we loved was in that sort of situation, we'd probably say the same thing to them, because in the back of our minds there's always the saying that the only hole you can't dig yourself out of is the grave. In the more modern American World Tour productions, he takes interest in Esmeralda as a person when he has conversations with her, and in the tavern song sequence, they start to get a little bit more intimate, shall we say. While Frollo has a scene later that, for all of those of you who haven't seen the play, he tries to force himself onto Esmeralda in a way that's more disturbing than him grabbing her by the arm and sniffing her hair. But like in the movie, Phoebus respects Esmeralda's boundaries. He invites her in for a little one-on-one banter, and she willingly goes along with it, but it is done with mutual consent, and neither of them using tactics of wooing the other with wit or charm or good looks to get closer to the other. There is, however, a song exclusive to the German production called Weil du liebst, or Out of Love, where Phoebus has a little heart-to-heart with Quasimodo in asking for his help to find the Court of Miracles and warn Esmeralda. I'll provide a link to a piano track so that you can get the lyrics to it, but it's a really nice, tender song that fleshes out the bond that they developed through their love for Esmeralda. Phoebus says that he recognizes and empathizes how Quasimodo has lived his whole life in pain and fear, but also challenges him to think about just what he's willing to dare to prove his feelings for Esmeralda in this line of the song: "Life is full of spikes and thorns, full of things that wound and chafe. So we start the minute we're born, learning how to play it safe. Then there comes a choice that's clear, comes a choice we're frightened of. And we pass it by out of fear, or we do it out of love." Now, it should be made inescapably clear that in all of these adaptations, the Disney film, the Disney stage musicals, or certain other film adaptations, Esmeralda shouldn't be accused of being shallow or oblivious to Quasimodo's person and his feelings, nor should her falling in love with another man be seen as rejection towards Quasimodo. In the Disney movie, her love for Quasi is more akin to the kind you get from a best friend or an older sister, the kind of love I've previously mentioned she reserves for Gringoire in other adaptations, where it's described as to be two and at the same time one. And in conclusion of this video, that's really the healthiest kind of love you can deliver right out of the gate, with a kind of love that isn't super intimate or dependent upon lifelong commitment, but is just enough to be nurturing, supportive, and willing to make personal sacrifices to ensure the well-being of others. Love is supposed to be about being supplemented rather than being completed by having another person in your life. Just because Esmeralda's in love romantically with Phoebus doesn't mean that there isn't also room for Quasimodo in her heart and her life. Even if that means that Quasi has to accept Esmeralda's decision to go with another man if that's where her heart leads her, he ultimately respects her choice without harboring any feelings of resentment toward her for it. The only man who doesn't belong in Esmeralda's life is Frollo, with his mindset of, if I can't have her, then nobody can. But the fact that Esmeralda has more than one man in her life who would fight to the ends of the earth to save her should be seen as more for her, not less for either of them. And I think that's something that more people in the world, both who are fans of Disney's Hunchback or anyone looking for any kind of romantic involvement in their lives, should really take into account, or at least take into some consideration. Of course, that's just my take on the story. If you have anything else you'd like to comment on, be it something you'd like to add or any points you disagree with me on and wish to discuss, I'll read them in the comment section, as long as they are well thought out, well articulated, and done in good faith. I would look forward to hearing from you, whatever you have to say, and until next time.